Hi, I'm Mark Commerdall from CorticalMetrics. This talk is about the history of the science and technology of cortical metrics and the brain gauge. This actually was inspired by the work of a guy named George von Bekesche back in the 1950s and 60s. And what he did was, through a whole bunch of sensory perceptual experiments, he figured out the concept of lateral inhibition. Inhibition is what's denoted here. So basically what von Bekesche did with a series of sensory experiments, things where he either with a sense of touch or the sense of hearing or the sense of vision, and actually he also did some taste experiments and smell experiments, but they all pointed to this concept of lateral inhibition. And he did that all from sensory experimentation. So he came up with this idea that of this center surround organization and what that means is that if you stimulate one place on the skin, it activates one place in the brain, and what happens to the surrounding areas in the brain is it turns off this activity in those areas in the brain. Well, that's actually what we found in 1980s and 90s. And so if you look at this image in the bottom right hand corner, you'll see a very prominent peak that's red, and it's surrounded by a zone of inhibition. So the next step we took was looking at more and more of the patterns of response that we got from skin stimulation. And what we wanted to look at was the different kinds of complexity that we saw. So if you look at this pattern here, you see these patterns in the brain, even the most simple of stimuli, were very complex. But we began to see some very robust patterns emerge that we could measure and that we could correlate to sensory percept. And one of the patterns that we see here in the top left is actually looking at how two different areas of the brain interact and how those interactions change under different conditions. So in one condition, it's very easy to tell the difference between the two spots where the two spots received activation, and in the other condition over here is very difficult to determine the difference between two areas. In other words, the contrast between those two areas got turned off. And what we did was we started doing a series of experiments where we started looking at the different patterns that we saw in the brain and to different types of stimulus conditions. And we looked at how those different stimulus conditions generate different sensory percepts in humans. And basically, these patterns are very high resolution. They were collected at 6 micron resolution. The typical medical imaging technology that you see is 1 to 2 to 3 millimeters. That's fairly large. But looking at very high resolution patterns, we noticed some very robust concepts that we wanted to compare to human sensory percept. When we compared them, we got some very nice correlations. Now, one thing that we did was we began making these one way we made those correlations with sensory perceptual tests. And when we started using those sensory perceptual tests that were designed by those same experiments where we looked at patterns of cortical activity, we were able to start collecting data on different subject populations. And one thing that we did was we designed different tests to target different mechanisms and different pathways. And when we collected data using those sensory perceptual tests, we started generating CNS profiles. And those profiles that you can see here are represented here in 2 dimensions. The profiles are actually, in this case, are in 8 or 9 dimensions. But it's all been squished down to just a 2-dimensional plot. But basically, this is one of our first data sets where we differentiated concussion from non-concussed individuals. And we did that with a 99% confidence level. And so that encouraged us to move on and take it to the next step. And the next step was actually making this more useful, scientifically. And those 8 or 9 dimensional plots were not very useful for people. So we started coming up with a user-friendly design that enabled CorticalMetrics for translational applications. In other words, if you look at this plot, it's really a lot easier to look at than the last plot that I showed you. But you can see that just intuitively, day 1, day 7, day 21, that the metrics that we're tracking post-concussion on this individual intuitively look better. Pre-treatment versus post-treatment data also showed a lot of promise for using CorticalMetrics as a method for tracking treatment efficacy. And that was basically more recently, in the last year. And then the results of some of our formal research studies this year, we showed that if you're familiar with ROC analysis, that ROC analysis, a perfect score is 1.0. And in this case, our area under the curve using multiple measures of concussion gave us a accuracy of 0.979. So 0.8 is considered very good, and we got a score of 0.9. 0.5 means random. So what that does, that all told us, that over the history of this, we probably, obviously, the history of this tells you that tactile stimulation is a very good way to look at neurological disorders. And the one question is, why didn't people do that before? Well, one reason is, here's a picture of traditional sensory testing tool. It's called the Von Freiherr. And most researchers for the past 50, 60 years were pretty concerned with threshold testing. In other words, how sensitive is the skin? That's a little bit like trying to figure out how well the brain works based on how well someone's eye works, or someone's vision, or or the hearing loss they might experience in the outer ear. But basically, being so focused on skin stimulation, on very minor stimuli, they're very small. So if the stimulus is very small, this is basically what the person would feel. It would be buried in the noise. And that was what most people were concerned with. So we said, well, we definitely have to develop new ways to do this. The technology actually ran in parallel. Obviously, we couldn't have collected all the data we did that I just showed you without decent technology. And here's a basic schematic or diagram of the technology as it developed. And back in 2004, when we were just starting to do sensory perceptual tests, we had something that weighed about 100 pounds. And the way this came about was just through conversations between myself and Bob Dennis. And I basically Bob asked, what could he do to help with our research? And I described, well, we need to deliver at least 2 points to the skin to study a lot in a very controlled manner. And Bob, said, okay, we'll try to do that in my senior design class. And his undergraduate senior design students worked on this a whole semester, and they failed miserably. So that's when we started working off campus. And Bob took a weekend and some fishing wire and some plastic and got something to work. And we got money to start to actually, that was a prototype for the world's first portable tactile stimulator, which you see here. And that stimulator was very good at delivering stimuli to the back of the hand. Worked great. Scientifically, that's the best way to go. But people don't like to put their hands inside boxes to get tested. So we changed the design so that we would stimulate the digits and the fingertips. Much easier to do, and this was a little bit more portable. Then by 2013, we have what's now called on the website the BrainGauge Pro, and it's a miniaturized, the result of miniaturizing those electronics. And so this has gone from 15 pounds down to 5 pounds down to about 2 pounds now for the CM6 for the current Brain Gauge Pro. And then now we've reduced it to our Brain Gauge 1.0, which the weight is insignificant and it's obviously extremely portable. So this is a computer mouse-like version that works very well and is being used in a lot of studies right now. And if you're interested in finding out more about cortical metrics or the brain gauge, visit our website. And there's also additional reading listed on here for the technology or the science.